Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are attempting something that feels a bit like ghost hunting.
That's a good way to put it.
We're trying to tune into a frequency that has been almost entirely drowned out by the static of, what, 26 centuries?
2,600 years.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to even imagine.
We're going back to the archaic period of Greece, specifically the late 7th century BC, to talk about a writer who is, at the same time, the most famous and maybe the most invisible figure in the entire Western canon. We are talking about Sappho.
Sappho of Lesbos.
No.
And, that name carries so much weight. In antiquity, she wasn't just a poet.
Hmm.
Plato, of all people, referred to her as the 10th muse. Other sources, they just called her the Poetess.
Right, in the same way Homer was just the poet.
Exactly. There was no need for a name. The title was enough. Everybody knew who you were talking about.
That distinction, the Poetess, is what really stopped me in my tracks when I was prepping the stack for today. It implies a level of fame, of ubiquity, that is. It's just hard for us to grasp now.
It is.
But here's the hook, and really the tragedy of this entire deep dive. We are essentially profiling a phantom. Scholars estimate her total output was somewhere around 10,000 lines of poetry.
That is the going estimate, yes. And that's based on how the scholars at the Library of Alexandria organized her work centuries after her death. They filled 9 distinct volumes.
9 books, 9 full papyrus rolls, and today we have, what is it, roughly 650 lines.
And lines is a generous term for some of them.
It really is. We're talking about a single word on a tiny shred of papyrus, or a phrase quoted by some later grammarian just to explain a verb tense.
Completely out of context.
We have lost about 97% of the work of someone who was considered the equal of Homer.
It is, and I don't think this is an exaggeration. Arguably the greatest single loss in the history of world literature.
How do you even come back from that?
Well, that's the challenge. Imagine if all we had of Shakespeare were, say, 2 sonnets and maybe 3 random sentences from Hamlet. And from that, you had to reconstruct his entire reputation, his genius. That's the task we face with Sappho.
So, okay, our mission today is to sift through this debris. We're going to try to reconstruct the woman, the music, because this was absolutely music, not just text, and all the controversy that has surrounded her for millennia.
It is a lot of controversy.
And I want to get into the weeds on this. I want to understand not just that we lost her, but how. How does a civilization lose an author of that magnitude?
That how is, it's a real detective story. It involves changing technology, linguistics, religious shifts, and honestly, just plain neglect.
But before we get to how we lost her, we need to understand who we lost. We have to ground her in some kind of reality, because for a very long time, Sappho was treated almost like a mythological creature, not a real person.
That's right. So let's start with the basics. The map.
Right. So she's from the island of Lesbos. It's in the northeastern Aegean, very close to the coast of modern-day Turkey.
Yes, and she was born around 630 BC. Maybe a little earlier, maybe a little later. The dates are a bit fuzzy.
And I think we need to clear up a misconception right away. When people hear Greek island, they might picture some quaint backwater fishing village. Lesbos wasn't that at all.
Oh, not even close. Far from it. In the 7th century BC, Lesbos, and specifically the main city of Mytilene, where Sappho probably lived, was a powerhouse. It was a thriving commercial hub.
A cultural center.
A huge cultural center, yeah. It was deeply connected to the kingdom of Lydia on the mainland, which was fabulously wealthy. Mytilene was sophisticated, it was rich, and it was culturally very distinct from places like Athens or Sparta, which get all the attention in the history books.
And a big part of that distinction was the language, wasn't it? They spoke a different dialect of Greek.
Yes, Aeolic Greek. And that distinction is absolutely crucial to her whole story, especially to the story of why she disappeared.
How different was it, really? Like, could an Athenian understand someone from Lesbos?
They could, but it would sound strange. Provincial to an Athenian ear. Aeolic had different vowel shifts, the accentuation was different, and it kept some really archaic letters, like the digamma.
The digamma. Okay, what's that?
It's basically a W sound. Most other dialects had lost it by this point, but Aeolic kept it. So the language itself had this specific flavor, this sense of otherness compared to the mainland Greeks, who would later dominate the historical record.
And Sappho wasn't just some random citizen living there. She was aristocracy through and through.
Oh, absolutely. The sources, even the confusing and contradictory ones, all suggest she was part of a very specific social stratum that was incredibly wealthy and this is key, incredibly unstable.
What do you mean by unstable?
Well, she was almost certainly a member of the old landed gentry, what the Greeks called a genos. The biographical tradition links her family to the high stakes and often violent local politics of the island.
And you can see the wealth in the poems themselves, right, in the fragments.
You can. She talks about purple headbands from Sardis, the capital of Lydia. She mentions ivory, gold, fragrant perfumes. These aren't the observations of a commoner. This is the inventory of a woman who knows what the best things in life are and what they cost.
But as you said, the money didn't buy safety. This was one of the things that surprised me most in the prep. She was in exile. We have this image of her sitting in a quiet garden, strumming a lyre, but she was actually a political refugee for a period of her life.
That's right. There's a document called the Papyrus Chronicle. It's this huge marble stele that was found on the island of Paros, and it lists major events in Greek history year by year.
A timeline set in stone.
Literally. And it records that Sappho was exiled to Sicily somewhere around 600 BC. This puts her right in the middle of the violent factional conflicts that were tearing Mytilene apart at the time.
So what was going on?
The old aristocratic families like hers were fighting against a series of tyrants. Now, tyrants in the Greek sense doesn't mean evil dictator, necessarily. It just means someone who seized power outside the normal constitutional order.
A strong man.
A strong man, exactly. And one of them, a man named Pittacus, eventually consolidated power.
And Pittacus is an interesting figure because he's later remembered as one of the 7 sages of Greece. History paints him as this wise, benevolent ruler.
It does. But if you're Sappho or a member of her family, he's the guy who kicked you out of your home and forced you to flee across the sea.
It's a different perspective.
A very different perspective. Her contemporary and fellow poet from Lesbos, Alcaeus, wrote these vicious, scathing attack poems against Pittacus. Sappho's work is much more subtle about the politics. But the fact of the exile proves she wasn't just a bystander. She was part of a clan that was powerful enough and dangerous enough to need removing.
So that's the political backdrop. Let's get more personal. Let's talk about the rest of the clan. The family dynamics are where we start to see the real woman peeking through the cracks of history.
Yes, because we have names.
We do. We have accounts of 3 brothers, Charaxos, Larichos, and Eurygios. And the drama with Charaxos is honestly something you'd see on a reality TV show today.
The Charaxos saga is our best glimpse into Sappho as a sort of moral authority within her own family. The story is preserved by Herodotus, the historian, and a few other sources.
And what's the story?
The story is that Charaxos was a merchant. He sailed a lot, trading goods, probably wine from Lesbos. On one of his trips, he's in Naucratis, which was a Greek trading post in Egypt.
Okay.
And while he's there, he becomes completely infatuated with a very famous courtesan, a hetera, named Rhodopis.
And infatuated is putting it mildly from what I've read. He spent an absolute fortune on her.
A colossal family-ruining fortune. He ransomed her. He bought her freedom from her pimp, presumably so he could live with her. This is a massive drain on the family estate.
And a huge public embarrassment.
A huge embarrassment. And when he finally returns to Lesbos, Sappho doesn't exactly welcome him home with open arms. She reportedly savaged him in her poetry. She called him out publicly for it.
Now, for a long time, this was dismissed as just a story, right? Maybe something Herodotus picked up and embellished. But this is where the archaeology, the recent discoveries come in and just change everything.
This is the brothers' poem. Its discovery, or at least its publication in 2014, was a pivotal moment in Sappho's studies.
What does it say?
The papyrus proves that the family drama wasn't just gossip. In the poem, the speaker, who is undeniably Sappho, is praying. She's expressing this deep anxiety about Charaxos' ship arriving safely. She prays to the Nereids, the sea nymphs, for his safe return.
So she's worried about him.
She is, but the tone is tense. It's not just, I hope my dear brother is safe. It's more like, I hope he gets back here in one piece and finally fixes the mess he made and restores our family's honor.
It grounds her. It's incredible. It transforms her from this abstract 10th muse into a sister who is stressed out about the family finances and her brother's terrible life choices.
Exactly. And then you have the other brother, Larichos. He's a different story.
Yeah, Larichos serves a different function in her biography.
He does. Sappho, in another fragment, seems to boast that he was a wine pourer in the Britannian. That was the town hall of Mytilene, the civic heart of the city.
Now, to a modern ear, bragging that your brother is a waiter sounds odd.
It sounds very strange. My brother pours drinks for the city council.
Right.
But in Mytilene, this wasn't a service job. It was a prestigious ritual office.
Yeah.
It was an honor reserved for the most beautiful and high-born young men of the aristocracy.
So it was a public display of status.
A public display of the family status and of the boy's physical perfection, his kalos. By mentioning this, Sappho is signaling to her audience, We are the elite. We are the beautiful people. We are the ones who serve the gods and the state in these honored positions.
Okay, so we have the messy brother and the perfect brother. Now we have to address the husband. And this, for me, is my favorite part of the Sappho myth because it reveals so much about how history, specifically male-dominated history, treated her.
Oh, this is a classic.
The Suda, which is this
Yeah.
massive Byzantine encyclopedia from the 10th century AD.
So, written over 1,500 years after she died.
Right. It claims she was married to a man named Cerculus of Andros.
And this is, without a doubt, the most famous dirty joke in all of classical scholarship.
It has to be. I mean, break down the etymology for us because it is not subtle.
It is aggressively unsubtle. The name Cerculus is derived from the Greek word kerkos, which means tail, but was standard, common slang for penis.
Okay.
And Andros, while being a real Greek island, is also the genitive form of the word anerner, which means man.
So
the encyclopedia effectively records that the greatest female poet in history was married to Dick Alcock from the Isle of Man.
it's just unbelievable that this made it into a serious reference work, but it didn't come from nowhere, right? This joke had an origin.
All certainly. It came from the comic playwrights in Athens in the 4th century BC, a couple hundred years after her death. Sappho became a stock character in Athenian comedy.
And what was that character like?
Well, the playwrights, all men, didn't know what to do with a woman of such power, fame, and independence. So they neutralized her. They turned her into a joke, specifically a sexually voracious heterosexual joke.
They couldn't compute a woman being a genius, so they made her all about sex.
Precisely. And giving her a husband with a grotesque, hyper-masculine name is a way of correcting her independence. It's a way of saying, sure, she might be a genius, but she's still defined by a man, even a ridiculously named fictional one.
It's a hostility that's disguised as humor. And that same kind of hostility seems to be what fuels the other big biographical myth, the suicide.
Delete from the Leucadian cliffs.
Exactly. The image of Sappho, heartbroken, leaping to her death because a handsome ferryman named Phaon didn't love her back.
This image is iconic. It dominated 19th century art. You see these paintings of the tragic poetess, lyre in hand, plunging into the sea. But it is pure 100% fiction.
Phaon wasn't a real person.
Phaon is a figure from myth. He's an old ferryman who was given the gift of magical youth and beauty by the goddess Aphrodite. He wasn't a real guy. Sappho did it on Lesbos.
So where did this story come from? How did it get attached to her biography?
It's likely a conflation, a misreading. Sappho probably wrote a poem about the myth of Phaon. Or perhaps she wrote a poem where she adopted the persona of a woman who was in love with him, a common poetic device.
And later readers took it literally.
Later readers who had lost the nuance of the lyric persona assumed she was writing a diary entry. They read a line like, I love Phaon, and thought, oh, the historical Sappho was in love with a historical guy named Phaon.
That is such a crucial distinction, the difference between the poet and the persona. We don't assume a novelist who writes about a murder is a murderer themselves.
We don't.
Yeah.
But with female poets, especially in the ancient world, there's this persistent historical tendency to assume everything is autobiography.
And the suicide narrative, it serves as a similar function to the husband joke, doesn't it?
It does. It punishes her for her greatness. If she kills herself over a man, it recenters her entire life's narrative around male desire and rejection. It makes her tragic and pathetic, rather than powerful and self-sufficient. It straightens her legacy in the most violent way possible.
Okay, but there is one relationship that scholars treat with a bit more respect, and that's her relationship with her daughter, Cleis.
Yes, we have a beautiful and very famous fragment where she speaks about her. She says, I have a beautiful child, Pace, who looks like golden flowers, my darling Cleis. And then she says she wouldn't trade her for all of Lydia.
Not even for all the wealth in the world.
Exactly. Now, the scholarly debate here has focused on that word Pace.
Right, because it can mean different things.
It can. Pace can mean child, your biological offspring. But it was also used in pederastic context to mean a younger beloved or partner. And it can even mean slave.
So some people have argued Cleis might have been a younger lover, not a daughter.
Some have, yes. But in this specific fragment, Sappho uses the word agapata, which means beloved, in a way that usually implies family affection. And the comparison to golden flowers just feels so intensely maternal. The overwhelming scholarly consensus is that Cleis was her daughter and that she was probably named after Sappho's own mother, which was the standard Greek naming convention.
Okay, so if we strip away Prick from the Isle of Man and the melodramatic cliff jumping, what are we left with?
We're left with a woman who is aristocratic, politically active, deeply invested in her family's honor and finances, and a mother A real complex person living in a turbulent time.
That's the life. Now let's move to the work. The reason we are still talking about her 2,600 years later?
The poetry, or more accurately, the songs.
Yes. You mentioned earlier the distinction between Sappho and the epic poets like Homer or Hesiod. This shift to what we call the lyric eye seems to be the defining moment in the history of Western literature.
It's a seismic shift.
Yeah.
It's impossible to overstate how revolutionary it was. Think about the Iliad. How does it begin? Sing, goddess of the wrath of Achilles.
The poet is invisible.
Totally invisible. He's just a conduit, a channel for the muse to tell a grand story of gods and great men doing great things on the battlefield. Sappho flips the camera around. She points it directly at herself, at her own feelings. She validates the subjective individual experience as a worthy subject for art.
There's that incredible fragment, it's fragment 16, where she makes this explicit. She basically writes a manifesto for this new kind of poetry.
Yes, she writes, some say an army of horsemen, some say foot soldiers, others say a fleet of ships is the most beautiful thing on the black earth. But I say it is what everyone loves.
I just want to pause on that for a second because it's so incredibly bold. She is listing the ultimate symbols of masculine power and glory in her world, the army, the navy, and she just dismisses them. She's saying, that's your definition of value. Mine is desire.
It is a radical revaluation of all values. She is asserting, with total confidence, that the internal movements of the human heart are just as valid, just as important a subject for high art as the movements of armies. And she's doing this in a culture that was hyper-masculine and militaristic.
And the way she describes that desire, that love, it's not abstract or philosophical. It's physical. It's visceral. And I think to really understand how this would have hit her original audience, we have to talk about the mechanics of her music.
We absolutely do, because we read these poems silently in books, and that's just not how they were consumed.
These were songs.
They were songs. The term lyric poetry means poetry to be sung to the lyre. Sappho would have performed these, most likely accompanying herself on an instrument called the barbitos.
Which is a specific type of lyre, different from the standard one.
Yes, the barbitos was a longer-armed lyre. It had a lower pitch than the standard Chile lyre that you see in a lot of Greek art. It had a deeper, richer, more resonant sound.
And we even know something about the musical scale she used.
We do. The ancient sources tell us she composed primarily in what they call the Mixolydian mode.
Okay, so explain that to those of us who aren't music theorists. What does the Mixolydian mode sound like?
Well, in modern terms, it's similar to a major scale, but with a flattened seventh note. But for the Greeks, the modes weren't just scales. They were associated with a specific ethos, or emotional character.
And what was the character of the Mixolydian?
It was considered emotional, piercing, and even sorrowful. It was a mode for high passion. The later Athenian tragedians supposedly learned it from her work to use in their most intense choral lamentations. So imagine her words being sung to a deep-pitched instrument with a melody that feels urgent, passionate, and slightly unresolved.
And then there's the rhythm. We have to talk about the sapphic stanza. This is a metrical form that she either invented or at least perfected, and it's incredibly distinctive.
It is. It's famous. A sapphic stanza consists of 3 identical long lines and then 1 short concluding line, which is called the Aeolic.
And it has this very specific heartbeat to it.
It does. It has a rhythm that's something like dum da 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 dum. It creates this driving forward momentum that pulls you through the first 3 lines, and then that short final line acts as a kind of break or a punchline or a moment of reflection. It's a perfect structure for conveying obsessive thought or spiraling emotion.
So let's look at how she uses that vessel, that combination of music and rhythm, in what we could call her greatest hits, the fragments that have become famous. We have to start with the Ode to Aphrodite, Fragment 1.
We have to. It's the only complete poem of hers that we have, and it survived by a total fluke.
How did it survive?
A literary critic from the Roman period, a man named Dionysius of Halicarnassus, quoted it in full in his treatise on literary composition. He used it as the perfect example of the polished or highly wrought style. He preserved it by accident just because he thought it was technically perfect.
And the structure of this poem is so fascinating because it starts out like a very formal prayer, right? Deathless Aphrodite of the spangled throne.
Yes. It follows the strict liturgical formula of what's called a colletic hymn, a hymn of calling. You invoke the god, you list their titles and attributes, you remind them of past times they've helped you, and then finally you make your current request.
But Sappho completely subverts the whole thing.
She does. Because when Aphrodite arrives in the poem, She doesn't come in some grand chariot pulled by fiery horses or dragons. She comes in a chariot drawn by sparrows.
Sparrow? Why sparrows? What's the significance of that?
In Greek symbolism, sparrows were associated with lechery. They were seen as hypersexual, constantly mating prolific breeders. They were sacred to Aphrodite for that reason. By choosing sparrows, Sappho is winking at the audience. She's acknowledging the earthy, urgent, erotic nature of her request.
And then the goddess actually speaks in the poem, and she doesn't speak like some booming, distant deity.
No, she speaks like an old friend, like a confidant.
The dialogue is so charming and intimate. Aphrodite smiles and asks, "Who is it this time, Sappho? Who has wronged you? Who must I persuade to lead you back to her love?"
And there's such a gentle humor in that line, "Who is it this time?" It implies a long-standing pattern. Sappho is essentially telling on herself. She's admitting she falls in love constantly and always needs the goddess to come bail her out.
It's amazing.
It portrays the goddess of love not as this terrifying cosmic force, but as a co-conspirator in Sappho's romantic life.
Okay, then we have Fragment 31. This is maybe her most famous poem after the Ode. It's the one that the Roman poet Catullus translated, and it's basically the definitive medical description of jealousy.
It is a staggering piece of psychological and physiological observation. The scenario is simple. The speaker, Sappho, is watching the woman she loves sitting across from a man. The man is just there, listening to the woman laugh and talk. And the sight of this completely dismantles Sappho.
The list of symptoms is just brutal. It's not an emotion I felt jealous. It's a complete physical collapse.
It is. She says her tongue breaks. A thin fire races just under her skin. Her eyes see nothing but blackness. Her ears are filled with a buzzing or roaring sound.
Oh, sweat.
Yes, sweat pours down her. A trembling seizes her whole body. And then that famous, unforgettable line, "I am greener than grass."
Greener than grass. In English, we say pale as a sheet, or maybe we connect green to envy, green with envy. But here it implies a sickly, chlorotic pallor, the color of a dying plant, like she's actually dying.
That's exactly it. The poem ends with the line, "I seem to myself to be a little short of dying." This single poem established the literary trope of love sickness for the next 2,000 years of Western literature. It defined eros not as a pleasant emotion, but as a pathology, a disease that attacks the body from the outside and takes it apart, piece by piece.
And finally, let's touch on the Tithonus poem. This is one of the more recent discoveries, or at least a more complete version was found on that 2004 Cologne papyrus. And it deals with aging, which is a theme we don't often associate with the poet of passionate love.
It's a deeply moving and very mature reflection on mortality. She compares herself to the mythological figure Tithonus.
Right, he was the guy who asked for eternal life but forgot to ask for eternal youth.
Exactly. So he just got older and older and withered away until he turned into a cicada. In the poem, Sappho looks at her own aging body. Her hair that was once black is now white. Her knees that used to be nimble for dancing are now heavy and weak.
But she doesn't just despair. There's an affirmation at the end.
There is. It's a statement of incredible resilience. She says, "But I love the finer things." The Greek word is habrosine.
What does that word really mean?
It's hard to translate with one word. It means delicacy, luxury, refinement, a certain kind of tender beauty. She says that for her, this love of beauty, eros, is connected to the desire for the sun, for brightness. She's choosing to find value in the aesthetic beauty of the world, even as her own physical capacity to participate in it fades. It's beautiful.
So we have this body of work that is psychologically acute, technically perfect, and emotionally raw, which brings us back to the massive central question. How on earth did we lose it? If she was the 10th muse, if she was the poetess, why don't we have those 9 volumes?
This is where we have to debunk the popular villain of the story.
Which is the church burning the books.
Right. There are these persistent legends, which were very popular with Renaissance scholars like Joseph Justus Scaliger and Girolamo Cardano, that the early church, specifically fetzers like Gregory Nazianzen or Pope Gregory VII, ordered the public burning of Sappho's works because they were too erotic, too immoral, too pagan.
It's a compelling story. It's dramatic. It gives us a clear enemy, censorship.
It's a great story.
Yeah.
But there is zero contemporary evidence for it ever happening. Not a single source from the time mentions anything like it. The truth is likely much more boring, and in a way much more tragic. It wasn't a bonfire, it was a format change.
The shift from the papyrus scroll to the parchment codex.
Exactly. From about the 2nd to the 4th centuries AD, the entire technology of the book changed. The world moved from these long papyrus scrolls to parchment codices, what we would recognize as a book with pages.
And this was an expensive process.
Incredibly expensive. You couldn't just copy everything over. You had to make choices. So what gets copied? You copy what's popular, what's being taught in schools, what's considered part of the standard curriculum.
And Sappho had a major strike against her, the dialect.
The Aeolic Greek we talked about earlier. By the Roman period, the standard literary Greek was Attic, the dialect of Athens. To readers in the Roman Empire, Sappho's Aeolic dialect looked weird on the page. It had strange spellings, unfamiliar grammar. It was just plain hard to read.
So it's like, imagine if the greatest poet in English wrote in a very heavy, archaic regional dialect, and then fast forward 500 years, and nobody speaks that dialect anymore. Teachers aren't going to assign that to their students because it's too much of a headache to explain.
That is the perfect analogy. And if you're not on the syllabus, you don't get copied. And if you don't get copies from the scroll into the new durable codex format, you effectively stay on the old decaying operating system.
And papyrus, in a European climate, doesn't last.
It has a shelf life of maybe a couple of centuries, if you're lucky, before it rots or gets eaten by worms or just falls apart.
So she wasn't burned, she just rotted away. That is arguably sadder than a bonfire. It's death by neglect.
It is. It's the survival of the fittest applied to literature, where fitness equals ease of reading and teaching. She was too difficult, so she was left behind.
But, and this is the incredible recovery part of the story, papyrus does survive in one specific climate.
The desert.
The desert. And that brings us to a place called Oxyrhynchus. This name sounds like a dragon from a fantasy novel, but it's a real town in Egypt.
It means city of the sharp-nosed fish. After fish, they worshipped there. It was a provincial capital in Roman Egypt, and in the late 19th century, two young Oxford archaeologists, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt, went there.
And they weren't looking for gold tombs or pharaohs.
No, they were looking for paper. Specifically, they were looking for the town's ancient garbage dumps.
Literal trash heaps.
Mounds of trash, some of them 30 feet high. And because of the incredibly dry sand, the garbage had been mummified for centuries. They started digging, and what they found was a literary treasure trove.
What kind of stuff was in there?
Everything. Tax receipts, census returns, private letters, shopping lists, and torn-up books. It turns out, when the ancients were done with a scroll, or it got too damaged, they just threw it in the trash like we would an old newspaper.
So this is where our fragments of Sappho come from.
A huge number of them, yes. Grenfell and Hunt shipped massive wicker baskets full of this literary garbage back to Oxford, and for the last 120-plus years, scholars have been painstakingly piecing these fragments together like the world's most difficult jigsaw puzzle.
That's an amazing story. But the recovery isn't over, and it's not all so clean. We have to talk about the controversy surrounding the new finds. That Brothers poem we mentioned earlier, that didn't come from a regulated dig in the 1890s.
No, it didn't. It appeared on the antiquities market in 2014.
And this is the dark side of the recovery story.
It is. The Brothers poem and another one, the Kypros poem, were published by a scholar named Dirk Abink. The initial story he told was that they came from a private collection and that they had possibly been extracted from papier-mâché mummy cartonnage, basically old papyrus recycled to make mummy masks.
But that story fell apart pretty quickly.
It fell apart spectacularly.
Right.
It turned out the provenance, the history of ownership, was extremely murky. Allegations began to fly that these fragments had been looted or stolen from the official Oxyrhynchus collection at Oxford and then sold illegally on the black market.
And this connects to the Green Collection, right? The family behind the Hobby Lobby craft store chain?
Yes. They were buying up huge quantities of biblical artifacts, often with very questionable provenance, for their Museum of the Bible. It's a whole tangled web of scholarship, money, and the illicit antiquities trade.
So even now, the very act of recovering her voice is tainted by this modern underworld.
It complicates things immensely. We have the text, and the text is authentic. It's definitely Sappho. But the path it took to get to us in the 21st century involves potential crimes. It just adds another layer of shadow and controversy to her history.
Okay, so let's pivot to the final puzzle piece here, the social context. We know what she wrote, we have some idea of how we found it, but we still argue intensely about who she was in her own society. Specifically, what was she doing with all these young women she writes about in her poems?
This is the great Sappho question, as it's sometimes called. For the last century and a half, scholars have been trying to categorize her circle to put a neat label on it.
And the Victorian favorite, the one that dominated for a long time, was the schoolmistress theory.
This was championed by the great German philologist Ulrich von Wilhelmowitz Moellendorff. He was a giant in the field, but he simply could not reconcile great poetry with what he saw as immoral lesbian sexuality.
So he came up with an explanation.
He argued that Sappho was essentially a headmistress of a Mädchenpensionat, a German-style boarding school for elite young girls.
Which is such a projection of his own time onto the past. It's like Jane Eyre superimposed on archaic Greece.
It's a complete anachronism.
Yeah.
He argued that the love she expressed in the poems was purely pedagogical, that she was just a teacher training these girls in the arts to prepare them to be good wives for aristocratic men. It was an attempt to sanitize her, to make her respectable and safe for the 19th century classroom.
But there's no evidence for it.
Absolutely none. There is no ancient source that ever suggests she ran a school.
Okay, so if not a school, what's another theory?
Another one is the Theosos theory, that she was the leader of a religious cult or association.
A theoso?
Exactly. We know that these kinds of religious associations for women existed. So if Sappho was the leader of a group of women dedicated to the worship of goddesses like Aphrodite and the Muses, it would explain the hymns, the ritual language, and the strong sense of group identity you find in the poems. It's more plausible than the school.
But the theory that seems to be gaining the most traction now is the symposium theory.
Right. We know that aristocratic Greek men had symposia. These were formal drinking parties where they would recline, drink wine, recite poetry, do business, and solidify political and erotic relationships.
So the idea is that women did this too.
The idea is that Sappho's circle was a female counterpart to the male symposium, a group of elite, aristocratic women gathering in a private space to dine, drink, compose, and perform poetry for each other and forge their own social, emotional, and erotic bonds.
And that leads us, unavoidably, to the sexuality question. The elephant that has been in the room for centuries. Was she a lesbian?
Well, the answer really depends on your definition of the word lesbian.
Break that down for us. What do you mean?
Okay, so if you mean lesbian as a modern identity category, a fixed sexual orientation that defines a person's core being based on exclusive attraction to other women, then that concept didn't really exist in antiquity.
That's the social constructionist argument.
Yes, influenced by thinkers like Michel Foucault. That school of thought would argue that applying the label lesbian to Sappho is anachronistic. It's imposing our modern categories onto a world that didn't have them.
Because for the Greeks, sexuality was more about acts than identity, and about power dynamics, active versus passive.
Generally speaking, yes. However, other scholars, like Judith Hallett, for example, argue that this is just semantic hair-splitting.
So?
They would say, look at the poems. Sappho clearly centers her emotional and her erotic life on women. The electricity in her poetry, that passion, is directed at women. Men, when they appear at all, are usually rivals, obstacles, or peripheral figures like her brothers.
It's kind of wild that the word lesbian itself comes directly from her home island, and the word sapphic comes from her name. She is the literal etymological root of the entire concept.
She is. Which makes it all the more ironic that history spent so much time and energy trying to deny it. As we said, the comedy writers in Athens made her into a promiscuous heterosexual. Then the Victorians made her into a chaste, sexless schoolteacher. It wasn't really until the modern era that we allowed ourselves to just read the text for what it plainly says.
Speaking of reading the text, let's look at her legacy. Who are the people who kept the flame alive through those long centuries?
Well, the Romans were absolutely pivotal. The poet Catullus, as we discussed, didn't just translate her work, he channeled her. He breathed her poetry.
He used her meter, the sapphic stanza, to write about his own tortured love affair.
He did. And in a move that's just the ultimate tribute, he even named his own lover, Lesbia, in his poems.
That is the ultimate hat tip. Every single time a Roman read the name Lesbia, they were being reminded of Sappho and her island.
Exactly. He was placing himself in her lineage. And another one of the great Roman poets, Horace, also wrote extensively in her meters. He famously called her Mascula Sappho. Masculine Sappho.
Which sounds like an insult to our ears.
It does, but it was almost certainly meant as a high compliment. It was a recognition of her poetic power, her gravitas. He was acknowledging that she could stand toe-to-toe with any of the men in the canon.
So the Romans revered her. Then we have the long gap of the Middle Ages, and then she reemerges in a big way in the 19th century. The decadent writers, they seem to have a weird, dark obsession with her.
They did. Writers like Charles Baudelaire in France and Algernon Charles Swinburne in England, they were reacting against that prim, proper schoolmistress image.
They swung to the other extreme.
Completely. They turned Sappho into this figure of dark, forbidden sexuality,
Yeah.
a daughter of Desaad. They were fascinated by the idea of the lesbian vampire, the doomed sinner, the tragic, perverse anti-heroine. It was still a projection, just a much darker and more lurid one.
And then after them, the imagists. Ezra Pound, HD.
Yes. Pound and the modernists loved the fragmentation itself. They looked at the broken papyri where you have a single word, then a gap, then another phrase, and they saw a modern aesthetic. They felt the gaps, the silence, made the poetry more powerful, more open to interpretation. A line like "spring too long," Gungula.
It's pure minimalism.
It is, and it had a huge influence on the way modern poetry looks on the page with all of its white space.
And finally, and maybe most importantly, feminism.
The most significant reclamation of all. In the late 20th century, feminist scholars and poets finally stopped trying to explain away her life or her desires and started celebrating them. She became a kind of matriarch, the new woman of antiquity, independent, articulate, economically autonomous, and the head of a lost tradition of female art.
It really is a miracle of a survival story when you think about it. We started with 10,000 lines. We lost 97% of it, mostly due to a format change and a difficult dialect. And yet, somehow, she is still here. She is still the poetess.
It's a profound paradox, isn't it? We know so little about her, factually, and yet she feels closer, more immediate than almost any other ancient author. Homer feels like a marble statue. Sappho feels like a real person whispering in your ear.
So as we wrap up, what does this all mean for us? Why does Sappho still matter so much, aside from the hysterical curiosity of it all?
I think, for me, it connects all the way back to that lyric eye we started with. Sappho teaches us that the small, internal movements of the heart jealousy over a lover's glance, desire, the fear of losing your looks, the anxiety about a brother's bad behavior, are just as epic as the Trojan War. She validated the interior life as a subject worthy of the highest art.
That's a powerful takeaway. The intimate is epic.
And I would leave you, the listener, with one last provocative thought to mull over. We mourn the loss of the 9 volumes. We wish we had it all. But I want you to ask yourself, do we love Sappho for what she said? Or do we perhaps love her for the silence?
Silence. What do you mean?
The gaps, the missing pieces. Because she is so fragmented, she becomes a mirror. The Victorians looked into the gaps and they saw a respectable schoolteacher. The decadents looked and saw a dangerous sinner. The feminists looked and saw a revolutionary foremother. If we had all 10,000 lines, if we knew every detail of her potentially mundane daily life, would she still hold the same mystique? Or does the very fragmentation invite us, force us, to co-author the poems with her, filling in the blanks with our own desires, our own stories?
That is definitely something to think about. Maybe the fragments aren't a tragedy. Maybe they're an invitation. I would encourage everyone listening, go find a good translation, Anne Carson's Academy. If not, Winter is fantastic because she preserves the brackets and the empty space on the page. Read one of those broken lines and just see what you fill the blank with. Thanks for listening to this deep dive. We'll see you next time.